people came from Europe to colonize the Americas, for example, they found, they thought that this was just a kind of virgin wilderness, but in fact, the indigenous people had been manipulating the land for many, many years in South America and North America. I found that very interesting too, because we think of the Amazon in particular, which I believe is the largest forest in the world, as this kind of untouched wilderness that we're destroying. But in fact, it's been manipulated for many, many, many years. Thousands.
Yeah, I mean, there's no virgin forest out there really. There were big cities, certainly by the standards of the time in the Amazon, only a few hundred years ago. Europeans showed up and we massacred some people and we brought in diseases that killed an awful lot more. And the survivors kind of retreated into the forest and the forest regrew. But the very first people that went along the Amazon River and just sort of reported what they saw, reported seeing really quite large urban areas stretching back into what is now forest. And those disappeared very quickly because the people simply disappeared. And if you're in the Amazon, the forest will come back really very quickly. Within a couple of decades, or certainly 3 or 4 decades, you'll have regrowth, which is, to a layman's eye, indistinguishable from what was there before. So large areas of the Amazon, probably most of the Amazon, is in some sense a kind of overgrown garden. And we discover lots. Archaeologists are discovering these sort of remains of ancient cities. We know that people rework the landscape in lots of ways to do agriculture. We know there are large numbers of the trees in the Amazon were actually planted or encouraged to grow by local people. You can see the kind of groves of different productive trees, which are found along sort of old roadways and that kind of thing. The more you look, the more you discover on the forest floor to see that this is far from virgin. And much the same is true in North America. So Europeans in our romantic way, we tend to think that we stumbled on this sort of virgin world in the New World, but it wasn't really like that. It was a much busier place than we imagine, and a much more engineered place in a sense. What you can say, I think, is that the locals were a lot better at managing that than the Europeans who came in and brought their European ways of, you see this most strongly in attitudes to fire. For Europeans, think that fire is bad in forests. And so, we've been trying to suppress fire for a long, long time. And the result is you have such a build-up of forest, of sort of dry material on the forest floor, that when you do get a fire, it's a much bigger fire. And we're seeing some of the consequences of that now in the recent big wildfires. That's partly to do with climate change, but it's also to do with the way that we manage the forests. And so now there's a move back to what in our scientific way we call control burns. Yeah. So you go in, before at the start of the dry season, but before everything's really dry, and do small controlled burns that you can control, because that will reduce the amount of dry stuff on the floor, so that if there is a big flare up later on, it won't take off in the way that we've seen some do. So that's the traditional way of managing forests. You talk to indigenous communities, some of them have always done it. Some of them have kind of half forgotten, or it's a folk memory, but they take to it. And of course, the sort of more broad-minded forest managers are now going to indigenous communities and saying, well, how did you guys manage this? You seem to do it better than we did, and what can we learn? So there's quite a lot of re-education going on, quite a lot of relearning of, if you like, the old ways, to put it in a slightly romantic sense, of how forests were managed. And it turns out that these lessons are really, really important as the climate changes, and forests are more threatened by being, if you like, in an extreme environment for their survival. And if they're going to survive, if they're going to evolve to live in a rather warmer world, they're going to need all the tricks that we can come up with. And a lot of those, it turns out, are better known, not just by indigenous communities, but often just by regular rural communities. So some rural communities learn this stuff too. So I'm a great
Yes.
believer. I'm a great believer in listening to the people in the forests, and actually, I'm a great believer in giving the forests back, if you can use that language, to the people who know them best, and that's often maybe just smallholder farmers. I'm not saying that they should be frozen out, but certainly a lot of that knowledge is still with indigenous communities. It's amazing how it survived, but it is still there.